Verno College, James Madison, and is currently at University of West Florida, where she has also served as the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences for a decade. Jane has made innumerable significant contributions to psychology education, both within and outside of APA. So over the course of her year, she's worked with APA to develop guidelines or standards of academic performance from all levels, from high school through graduate levels of education, including chairing 3 different task forces addressing APA's undergraduate guidelines. I have the great pleasure of working with Jane right now on the revision, the 3rd revision of guidelines. She's also served as chief reader for the Psychology Advanced Placement reading, and she's presented at nearly every regional teaching conference in psychology. A founding co-chair of APA's Council on Baccalaureate and Associate Education, she co-chaired APA's Summit on National Assessment in Psychology and participated in that 2017 Summit on High School Psychology. Oh, I'm sorry, National Assessment, the Summit of National Assessment and High School Psychology. Her many publications most relevant to this conference include the Psychology Majors Companion, How to Get Where You Want to Go with Dana Dunn, and the Critical Thinking Companion for Introductory Psychology, which she co-authored with Cynthia Gray. Jane's contributions to psychology education have been recognized in many ways. She's received both a Distinguished Teaching Award and an award for applications in education and training from the American Psychological Foundation. APA named her an eminent woman in psychology, and the Society for Teaching of Psychology named their Early Career Award in her honor as a tribute to her mentoring of generations of psychology teachers at all levels. Jane's most recent research and consulting emphasizes assessment, and as she would say, assisting good departments to become great ones, and trying to help legislators and others with serious misconceptions about psychology understand the true nature of the discipline. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jane Hallinan to our IP Course Design Institute.
Thank you, Sue. And I'm so delighted to see the range of participation from across the globe. I mean, Hong Kong, Brazil, Canada, lots of folks from the States. It's really wonderful that everyone has convened, and I hope we can make this a smooth experience. I'm going to be with you for 4 different sessions, mostly focusing on outcomes and assessment, but I do have a couple comments to make, especially for individuals who are just starting out in teaching. By the way, that's one of the things I most love to do, is work with brand new people who don't have the answers and feel like imposters. So borrowing what Garth was talking about, let me just share one little tip at the outset that may be the most valuable thing that you learn as a new teacher. When students ask you a question that you don't know, say, "What an interesting question. What made you ask that?" Because that will give you a little more time to think through whether or not you can dredge up something from your memory banks. And if nothing else emerges, you can also turn the discussion over to the class, because you don't have to know everything. That may be a little bit odd to think about on the front end of your teaching career, but the more relaxed you can be, and borrowing again from Garth, the more authentic you can be, the more connected you're going to be with your students. So let's see here. I'm trying to advance my slides. There we go. One of the things I most love about teaching as a career is that it gives me the opportunity for do-overs regularly. I think if you're like most teachers, you really want to make it perfect. And if you're like me, by the time the very first class of the course is over, you've already blown it. But the quest for doing something perfect is something that I think really motivates us. And so what we're attempting to do with the IPI is to give people some incentives to think about how to make a course that is absolutely transformative. And that's why you see the image of the dragonfly that I found. I'm a great internet shopper, as you'll soon see, that it comes to represent all the things that what we're trying to do in creating an intro course that speaks to students, that helps them remember the most important things for their future. You heard in the introduction that I've been at 3 places, And what you see there is a picture of me in 1981 in my very first class. And I love the fact it's the only image that exists from my early teaching career, and my mouth is open. So it's a pretty good characteristic of how class tends to go. Now, my track through higher education has been a little bit odd because I started out at Alverno Women's College in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is the place that is often blamed for the assessment movement. What they did back in the 70s, which was really remarkable for the Franciscan nuns to come up with this, they were looking at a dire economic future, and they said, if we're going to go down, let's do an experiment and go down in flames. What is it that your students can learn from you that they can't afford to miss? And that launched a very radical way to design higher education. They threw out the grading system. They moved everything to performance-based assessment. And because this was my first appointment as an instructor, I was raised, since I'd not had any training as a teacher, like most of you, I was raised from the standpoint of thinking that outcomes were the most important thing. So I was there for about 17 years and thrilled to have been part of the Alverno crowd. From there, I went to James Madison University, which was also a very assessment-friendly place, and for my money has one of the best undergraduate programs of assessment in the country. And then from there, I went to the University of West Florida, where I served as a dean for 10 years and was so happy to go back to the classroom where I've been for now about 8 years. Along the way, because I developed this assessment expertise from the ground up, APA and I aligned so that I did end up doing a lot of consulting with them on assorted guidelines and standard settings initiatives over the years. And in fact, I like to joke that it must be that I have outcomes or us tattooed on my forehead because I get calls in relation to that. In addition, because of that expertise, not only do I get called the grande dame of assessment, which just shows you that if you teach long enough, you're going to have some interesting nicknames. But I also do probably the lion's share of academic program reviews in helping departments try to figure out what is a good strategy that they can manage that's efficient, that gives them evidence that they need. All right, so out of that assessment experience, what I wanted to share with you, and let me just backtrack a little bit for new folks. Assessment may not be a term that you're familiar with, but basically when you break it down to its Latin root, it means assere, to sit beside. So in assessment, what you're doing is you're sitting beside the learner and taking full measure of what the student is able to do. Assessment means that what you're trying to do is give evidence or assurance that learning has taken place. And that can cause faculty some consternation. And so in fact, in all of the faculty consultations I've done, where we're worried about what types of assessments should we use and what kind of grading efficiencies can we have, what should the rubric look like, all of those important questions, I pretty much found that faculty divided themselves up into these 6 categories. And I've used this image for many years because it just seems to be perfect to capture where we are. So as we do that, I want you to think about, where would you classify yourself? I'm assuming you're probably not assessment hostile. I have worked with faculty who've said, God, I hope I die before I have to do any assessment, which, especially for psychologists who should be interested in behavior and its consequences, that doesn't make any sense. There are the assessment resistant people. These are people who know assessment needs to be done, but just want to assign it to the junior faculty. There are the assessment neutral people. And so far, I've not met anyone in that category. Then if we slip to the positive side, the first 2 of those positives, I think, are the folks that are more inclined to come to sessions like this, where in assessment, you might not have all the answers, but you're kind of enthused about what it would mean to measure behavior and embark on ways to improve in search of that elusive perfection. Then there are people like me. I do everything that is accessible. I am energized by being able to have measures of how well my students are doing. I like to brag about how they're doing, and I have evidence to prove that they're learning what I'm asking them to learn. Unfortunately, I've also seen the development of, on the positive side, the assessment possessed, people who measure everything and overwhelm you with data and sort of lose sight of the joy of having this as a toolkit that help you improve personally. But recently when I presented this, a friend of mine said, you missed a category. He said, how about the assessment zombie, which is the individual who is being ordered to do assessment by some overlord on the campus who doesn't want anything to do with it, but agrees and like a zombie just plows through whatever the assignment is. So our outcomes for this session, here's what we're going to talk about. And there will be a breakout session where I hope you're not allergic to group work, because we do want you to make connections with new people and, what I like to say, develop assessment buddies that may ultimately be able to help you solve some problems later on as you embark on your own redesign. We're going to first talk about all of the diverse pressures that are coming to bear on people who are trying to do assessment. And you heard a little bit of that discussed earlier in Regan's presentation. We're going to look at distinguishing designing courses through course objectives, where the focus is on content, versus from student learning outcomes, which is what is it we want students to emerge with at the end. I'll then give you a process. I'll describe for you the IPI assessment team, which for my money was the hardest working of the groups that were convened in IPI. We met first, we met early, we met the longest, and we ended up with the most chapters in the book. Those are my sources of evidence for the claim that we were the hardest working. We'll review specifically the IPI student learning outcomes, and then we'll start to talk about looking at the student outcomes that integrate with your personal goals, as well as the goals of the assorted overlords that have something to say about what you're going to be doing in classes. So what's the problem? You heard some of this alluded to in earlier presentations. Intro Psych is just too big. Years ago, I wrote an intro textbook, and at the time, I think it was 800 pages long. And when I brought it home to my mother proudly, she said, oh, honey, nobody's going to buy that. It's too big. And she was right. Yeah, it went for 3 editions, but the fact is, even I got a backache carrying that sucker around. And so I think we're now seeing publishers getting more serious about understanding depth and meaningful exploration will be more important and will have potentially more transformative effects than covering the content. There are many competing ideas on how to do it right. And one of the things that in all of the APA projects I've been involved with, we've been steadfast about not saying, do it this way. These are all aspirational rather than prescriptive. Then there's the problem of the soft underbelly exposure, because you can't be expert in absolutely everything. For me, my soft underbelly is sensation and perception. Now, I know it's important, but I start to tremble whenever it is I'm going to teach it, partly because I had an experience in my very first year of teaching. I was teaching a very large class, 300 students, and when it came to question and answers, a student raised his hand and said, why do we see ourselves upside down in a spoon? Well, I didn't even know you did see yourself upside down in a spoon. That's how much I was paying attention. I had no idea how to answer that. And so I said, I have no idea how to answer that, but I'll figure it out and I'll come back with the answer, very content oriented. Another hand went up. Why is it when you're looking at movies and wagon wheels in Westerns appear to be rotating backward instead of forward? Like, wow. Don't know the answer to that one either. By the time the Stump the Prof game was over, there were 7 questions I couldn't answer. Now I did do due diligence and went and found it out and explained it in the next class. But what an opportunity missed to be able to talk about, well, let's talk about what it could be. Let's engage your critical thinking skills to see what hypotheses we can come up with. We all have a soft underbelly. We all need to recognize that there are places where we're going to feel more like an imposter than other places. In intro, we also have to contend with the fact that As we've already seen in the chat, some places teach it as a 2-semester course, others a 1 semester. In high school, as dual enrollment, as dedicated to pre-med students only, honor students only, online, hybrid. Think of all the permutations that we have in delivering the intro class. We also have external stakeholders that add additional pressures because since the MCAT now includes behavioral science as a foundational piece of what they assess, they have a stake in the game. And advanced placement, which you've heard a little bit about, the opportunity for students to earn college credit before they get to college, they certainly want to keep tabs on what's going on in intro classes so that they can prepare their students well and claim appropriately that they're as well prepared as if they'd taken a college class in intro. There's confusion about the end game, and I was really delighted to hear Garth suggest there's not confusion on our part anymore. This is not a class that is designed for majors only, with everyone else looking on. The fact is, intro is a class, it's probably a class that a majority of students, it's the only psychology class that they'll have. And because there are so many misconceptions about psychology, including the phrases, you can't get a job if you get a degree in psychology, totally wrong. We have an opportunity in intro psych to turn students, even if they don't major in psychology, into ambassadors to help clear up those misconceptions. So while there is confusion on some parts, there's no confusion for IPI. We want intro to be transformative for lives regardless of majors. To date, the APA guidelines, which I've been involved in now multiple times, this third iteration, it's been mute on intro expectations, but I'll give you an advanced organizer that in guidelines 3.0, which we hope will get passed sometime within the year, we have signed on to IPI's approach as a way of managing an effective intro class. And then there's this problem that assessment, depending upon where you are and how sophisticated your climate is, it's kind of been gamified into truth or dare. Now, what I mean by that, it's not an homage to Madonna, but it was inspired by a comment that a dear colleague, Dave Daniel, made to me about the realities of what happens in assessment, that so many people don't really care about the evidence of learning. They're more interested in just communicating the content, that when it comes time to generate evidence, they do it in a phony way. And so he said, he came up with the term that they commit faux-assessment. I love that terminology. I often distinguish faculty who get assessment versus those who don't as postmodern versus modern people. For modern people, assessment's kind of a necessary evil that you ramp up activity, maybe do some faux assessment, and hope that you don't get any dings from the assessors while they're there. But you don't really see it as a tool for improvement. Whereas postmodern people see it as a strategic tool that helps improve student learning and also helps improve the teacher in the process. Now, because I've been at the core of assessment because of my connection with Alverno, also recognize that we've been through some interesting decades of change in relation to assessment. So in the 1980s, when assessment started taking root, assessors, regional accrediting bodies would come and say, what's your assessment plan? How do you know you're teaching students critical thinking skills? And then by the 1990s, what they were saying was, well, show us data. We don't want to see your assessment plan. We want to see that you've activated the plan and that you have data to support your claims. In the 2000s, the movement was made to talk about how are you going to improve based on the data. And in 2010, the catchphrase that we heard from all assessors was, have you closed the loop? How are you using this as continuous improvement? And for my money, I wish we had stopped there, because unfortunately what I'm seeing in this decade is a word that is awful, which is disaggregation. What we're looking at there is the online class that you teach in your department, does it have equivalent outcomes to your hybrid class and your face-to-face class? Is there some way that we can tease out various comparisons? And so assessment used to be a relatively minor reporting obligation, but at this point at the year end, my assessment report for the department summarizing our progress now borders on 60 to 70 pages. It's an opus. I once encountered a chemistry teacher who was definitely in the, I'm not happy about this camp, but I loved the quote and have kept it. Here's what he said: you realize this is going to change the way we teach. And for those of us who recognize content is transient, I want to say, you betcha, and it should. Now, who are these overlords I keep talking about? Assessment presents us with multiple overlords. You can have, it used to be that you'd get the course, you might get assigned a book, but you could pick what you want. And then pretty much the first day of class, once the door is closed, you do what you want with the students. There was not much accountability. But now, if you take on an assessment, an introductory assignment, you might have instructions from the department, gen ed managers, university assessment officials, regional accreditors may be asking about your disaggregated data. The public may want to know what evidence you have. In my case, in the wonderful state of Florida, where legislators seem to know more about education than educators do, they want to know what your evidence is. And then, of course, professional societies. APA has been very good about helping us develop answers for questions. So clearly, we have to adapt to what I call the postmodern world. Recognize that not everyone believes college education is a good thing. For many students, it may not be. We are confronted with the fact that we are constantly involved in change. We have to recognize that a lot of people find professors among the least trustworthy professions ever because they see us as socializing students away from core values of the family. The challenge of doing the right thing and submitting performance metrics only to find out that the performance metrics lead to a reduction in your funding is another challenge. And then if we throw in post-COVID chaos and what is repeatedly being cited as the disengagement problem, clearly we're up against it. This is a hard job. Now, assessment does reflect a paradigm shift from moving from what's sometimes referred to as sage on the stage, the person who lectures, the talking head, to a guide on the side. The difference is content-centered versus learner-centered. And for me, an inspiring source I ran into way back early in my career in '83 was Stanford Erickson in this simple graph, which I've tried to reproduce. What matters is meaningful learning. Whatever students are going to learn by rote and cramming the night before will quickly disappear, but meaningful learning will stay with them. He compared teaching by covering the content to getting a sunburn, that the effects are fast, painful, and temporary. And so obviously, we want to put our efforts in areas where students will remember important things that will help them with their lives. Now, to those ends, many of us recognize that Bloom's taxonomy revised, this is a way to think about how complex is the cognitive level that you want students to achieve in your class, helps communicate the importance of this. So in very traditional instructional terms, the lower levels that are green, basically what you're shooting for if you're a talking head is you want students to remember and understand and spit back in some format. But if you're more interested in meaningful learning, you're going to be engaging in project-based activity that will help them do fancier things. You're going to help them apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. And so for those of you who may be new to Bloom's taxonomy, I just wanted to give a couple of examples. Lower level, you can do this lower level activity simply by memorizing. And you know, as a student, sometimes what you memorize, you really don't learn. But an example would be a simple, straightforward fact. What year was psychology officially founded? That's the only fact I require my students to learn about dates when I teach history of psychology. For understand, what we want to do is see if they can comprehend what that concept means. So an example here is what happens when the corpus callosum is cut. If you can remember, here's what the corpus callosum is, but now what happens if something disrupts that function? Higher order examples, if you're applying, you can still use objective testing strategies, a little bit harder, but learning principles are more fun to apply in projects. So what learning principles would you use to ask parents to reduce tantruming behavior? And if we step up to analyze, we're going to break some phenomenon into smaller parts. So what variables might contribute to sleep disorder? At the highest level, when things are even more fun, you want to ask students at evaluation, what decisions can you make based on the data that you see? What theory is best to explain language acquisition? In CREATE, now you're going to ask students to reach deep and do something new. And here's what we're up against there. Students, by the time they get to college, they've already decided if they're creative or not, and most have decided not. So you may have to unpack creativity in science is coming up with new ideas. Now, if I haven't convinced you of how hard our job is, it goes beyond purveying content. It helps us communicate to students what's most important, and the feedback we get from them can help us continuously improve. But sometimes it does feel like there's something sitting on our backs. So what we're going to do is we're going to move to a breakout session, small groups, and basically here's what we'd like you to do. We only want you to take about 10 minutes to do that, and we hope it will generate some questions and comments for the end. But number one, identify who you are and where you are. And I always tell my students, whatever group you're in, make sure you introduce yourself so that you at least put your footprint in the group right then. Then identify, where are you on my 6-category list of assessment? Which category would you fall in? And as well, how many overlords are up in your business? Is it an assessment friendly place, or is it an assessment possessed place that there's way too much going on, or have they not woken up yet? And then if there's leftover time, this is the fundamental question that Regan posed earlier. How should students in intro be different after they take your course? Right. In an earlier session, there was some discussion about the array of resources that are available. On this slide, I simply mention here all the outcomes work that APA has been doing over time. And the assessment cyber guide is available online through APA that gives you some background in assessment. There's also project assessment, which you heard about before, and the high school summit resources, and as well the kinds of things that Garth talked about that grew out of the TIP Northwest assessment. So currently our challenge is not having enough resources. In some ways, it's almost like we can be flooded with resources and not really know where to start. So that became part of the challenge of this group. This is the IPI Outcome Squad, also known as the Woolly Mammoths. And as a consequence, I do have my very own personal woolly mammoth that was a token from that experience. Jen Thompson and Kristen Whitlock were the leaders of the group, and they ended up being assigned with 3 of the most robust personalities in the teaching of psychology. So we knew right off the bat we were going to be in for some interesting times and arguments, and we certainly were. But ultimately, we were able to come up with, I think, a proposal that helps narrow down what might be most important, what kind of transformational change should we expect students to be able to do. Here are our working assumptions: that we needed broad conceptualizations because of how many formats people were using. We did choose to emphasize active learning, guide on the side, and authentic assessment strategies. We continue APA's tradition of not endorsing a specific or prescribing a specific way of doing things. And we wanted to honor prior work. So you've heard already about the national standards, APA Guidelines 2.0, soon to be 3.0 if all goes well. The Advanced Placement Group is now doing some course redesign in their protocols to align with the work of IPI, and then the pillars document for strengthening the Common Core. So you may have seen these before, but we're basically going to identify that we narrowed the overall large-scale outcomes to 3. One that deals with content, one that I like to say deals with the backbone of what psychology should be at the intro level, and that's scientific thinking. And then the part that I think most people get a little bit more excited about is the key themes, even if those key themes feel a little. Okay, so if we break out those indicators, psychology content, very straightforward, that what we're hoping students will be able to do is to have some familiarity to be able to define and explain the terminology that they encounter. Does that mean they have to identify every bolded term in the index? No, but they have to show some facility for being able to acquire that kind of information. Can they interpret research findings related to psychological concepts? And then a third outcome is, can they apply psychological principles to personal growth and other aspects of everyday life? And if you're like me, this is one of those places where I get most excited when students say to me, you know, I was watching television and I think I saw diffusion of responsibility. Well, yeah, tell me about that. That they're able to use the information from the course to break open the experiences that they're watching or participating in. So psychology content, fairly straightforward. Next, we go to scientific thinking. Probably my favorite phrase as an intro teacher is, what's your evidence for believing what you're telling me? Because one of the fun parts of teaching introductory psychology is how much misinformation and misconception students have, even about the nature of psychology. So if we're asking them to grow and change, we want them to be more astute in deciding what they should believe. What should they swallow and follow, or should they be more vigorous in trying to ask people for evidence to support any persuasion attempts that might be happening? So to break that further, we're solving problems using psych methods. Starting with, we're going to assume that a methods area will cover case studies, surveys, and experiments. There's a push to try to describe qualitative data and its value in even introductory psychology. For 2.2, one of the things we wanted to do was give students experience with research, whether they're looking at research designs that have been already published. And when you're working with intro students, my tip here is find badly designed experiments that it's relatively easy to find the flaws with. Students have a kind of inherent belief that if something's been published, then they shouldn't criticize it. And so you may be able to take experiments and redesign them to make the gap not as big for them. They can evaluate, they can design experiments or research, or they can conduct it if you have the kind of resources that allow for that. But notice that we're not obligating you to do all 3 of those or any one specific of those. 2.3, we're asking that an outcome should be they need to be able to draw logical and objective conclusions derived from empirical evidence. And so this is trying to wean them away from whatever you automatically think may not necessarily be the right way to go. You need to evaluate that to be able to determine if that's accurate. And then examine how psych science can be used to counter unsubstantiated statements, opinions, and beliefs. Next, we go to the key themes. We really argued a lot about these themes because I think we were originally inspired by Bridget Martin Hard's presentation. I think it was at NITOP on big ideas and intro. We liked what her approach was. We didn't quite accept the big ideas that she operated from. We sat back and said, well, now, wait a minute. If we're talking broadly about all kinds of psychology intro courses, what themes tend to pop up over and over again that help pull together? What is it that we want students to remember about the nature of psychology when they're no longer in the class. That's a way to think about the key themes. Those are integrated. We'll see them pop up from time to time throughout the course. So first is psych science relies on empirical evidence and adapts as new data develop. By the way, that's not good news for students who expect what is printed is permanent truth. If you've been teaching for a while, you recognize that some of the information that you taught a few years ago no longer is valid because it doesn't bear a hold up under replication, for example. And so being able to look at this is a plus associated with science, not a negative, that we're willing to change our position as data dictate. Second one, B, psychology explains general principles that govern behavior while recognizing individual differences. This is an important theme, excuse me, for students who, when you're rolling out a general conclusion drawn from research, that students will say, well, that's not my experience. My experience is this. And you don't have to negate that experience because in groups of people, individual experiences will vary. But what psychology has specialized in is trying to get at general principles. So there's a way you can honor that experience without necessarily endorsing it, that it's true for everyone. C, psychological, biological, social, and cultural factors influence behavior and mental processes. We recognize that psychology is influenced by lots of things. Behavior is influenced by lots of things. It's no longer the psychosocial, cultural model. We're looking at making sure that we take into account multiple layers and coming up with good, complex explanations. And in fact, one of the things that I'm happiest about in intro is when students move away from, I need to have a simple solution. An example would be, typically as an intro teacher, you're going to have a student come up to you at break and say, you know, my nephew still sucks his thumb. Why is that? It's like, well, okay, let me count the ways. Let me count the variables that might be involved in that. I can't give you a straightforward answer. It's pretty complicated. And psychologists, instead of being frustrated by that, we like it that way because it gives us a lot of wiggle room to be able to figure out what's most important. Item D, you already heard about from Garth. Psychology values diversity, promotes equity, and fosters inclusion. And let's face it, psychology hasn't always done that well. We have some ugliness in our history that we do have to contend with. But I like to counterbalance that with the fact that psychology has also contributed in positive ways for understanding discrimination and prejudicial treatment. And so while we don't want to negate the entire history of psychology, we do want students to understand we recognize there have been errors and we need to overcome it. And psychology, used properly, can help us achieve those grand outcomes that will help everybody out. All boats will rise. E, I have to say, is my favorite. Our perceptions and biases filter our experience of the world through an imperfect personal lens. Now, the reason I say that is my favorite is because when I took intro, I was on my way to being the world's greatest journalist. That was my major. And all of a sudden, I'm in this class where I feel like this individual is speaking a language that is welcoming me home. It was just like I'm a fish and the hook was set. The point where I knew I had to major in psychology was when we got to defense mechanisms. The conclusion that people distort reality to make themselves feel better, that it's not just a flat out lie, but that you lie to yourself to make yourself feel better. It's like, well, look at what people do. Oh, wait a minute, I'm a people. I bet I do that too. And having the insight that my take on reality has flaws, I swear, makes me a little bit more approachable when I'm dealing with conflict behavior. I can't guarantee that I'm absolutely right in what I thought I saw. And I want students to come away with that sense of humility. For F, applying psych principles can change our lives, our organizations, and communities. I know for many people, introductory psychology is a place where we can actually have service learning projects to get students out in the community. A few years ago, I had my intro psych students design a curriculum about how to deal with spanking behavior for parents that were working at a child abuse agency. Very powerful learning that they'll remember for a long time to come. And then G is important as well, because even though we do have some checkered issues in our history, especially with regard to ethics, it's important that students come away with more memories of intro psych other than Milgram and Zimbardo. They made huge contributions to us, but the fact is, students need to understand that we abide by ethical constraints for the good of the people we serve, the science we serve, and the people who are doing that work. All right, so that is a quick tour of the nature of outcomes that we thought would be most important. Now, when we come back in the afternoon, we're going to be looking at some specific strategies that align with those. So as you're thinking about those, did any of those outcomes align with the goals that you would bring to bear? Remember, I asked you to kind of navigate your way to that last question. How is it you think students should change as a result of being in your class? And what kinds of things might you need to do to help your course become more IPI friendly? Probably the main thing is not worrying so much about teaching students through multiple choice tests. They have a place, and to the extent that you can automate quizzes and that sort of thing, if you have the right learning management system, you don't have to deal with that so much in class. That frees you to be able to do things that students will remember longer term. So just as one example, when I'm teaching intro, I get the fun of being able to teach honor students. And so for their final exam, I don't have a multiple choice test. I ask a student who was in my class before to come in and role play a person who's asking for help. I require that the person be famous enough that students can recognize them, and I prefer a dead person rather than a live person. And then I basically turn the class over to the person to be interviewed. The students have to come up with questions. They have to come up with a tentative diagnosis. They have to come up with a treatment plan. They have to come up with ethics. And immediately students say, can we do more research on this? And I love that question, because I said, oh no, I would never want you to do more research on your final. And then they get it and they laugh. And I get these brilliant essays at the end of the course that reinforce for me, they understand what looks easy on TV. It ain't necessarily so. So assessment strategies, what we'll be leaning toward, and then we'll get to questions. We're going to emphasize active learning and authentic assessment over traditional multiple choice tests. We're going to focus on student learning outcomes rather than course objectives. Course objectives tend to be content specific. Here's the stuff we're going to cover. More important to say, here's what you're going to be able to learn to do. And if you're taking this focus, it frees you to figure out how to make learning and assessing more memorable and potentially more transformative. And as you've heard before, lots of exemplars in project assessment. So what our future holds in the next session is that we're going to look at some assessment exemplars and hope that you may be able, in a breakout session, I know that's not good news for those of you that don't like breakout sessions, but we really want you to be able to connect with others and share experience so that you can begin to develop your collegial connections as part of the very, very cherished psychology teaching community. This is how it's done. So we'll be looking at examples of things that you might do that you might want to talk about with your group. So plan on bringing either the best active learning strategy that you've tried in intro or something that you might remember from when you had intro to be able to talk about that. So with that, what I'd like to do is see if anyone has any questions or comments with the few minutes that remain.